sustainability is all about right relationship. And that's what we're going to focus on today, is looking at this relational aspect and doing it through sort of an ecological lens. I'm an ecologist, so that's where I come at this from. So I have a lot of interest in forest ecosystems and desert and alpine and Arctic ecosystems, and a lot of interest in evolutionary ecology, how these systems are not static but are always dynamic and changing. And so we're going to look at that as a model to start thinking about how we can be involved with human systems that really are modeled after natural systems, and as such can really thrive and do it in a way that is not creating violence to anything else. So that's what we'll look at today. So I want to talk a bit about the laws of thermodynamics, because we're going to get into a bit with energy today, and I think it's important you're sort of grounded in that, because that'll set the stage for looking at this process of coevolution, which I'm going to dive into a bit more. And then we'll start relating it to human systems. So we'll develop the ecological model and then start looking at it in terms of human systems. There are two major laws of thermodynamics. The first law is named the law of conservation of energy. It basically states that energy can't be created nor destroyed. And every time we've tested that, that's the way it's come out. Now, that doesn't mean that's actually the case. There may be areas in the universe where energy is being created, or areas where it is being destroyed. And if it is, we haven't discovered them. But every time we do test it, it seems like we can't create or destroy energy. It's sort of always been here. It's always going to be here. We can't do anything in terms of that sort of mode. So that's pretty powerful. But I think it's the second law of thermodynamics that has a lot more importance for us as humans, and that's the law of transformation of energy. And that law states that although we can't create or destroy energy, we can transform it from one state to another. So right now, filtered light is coming down. It's hitting the leaves of the trees around us. That light energy is being captured in these plants through the process of photosynthesis and being transformed into chemical bond energy. So there's a transformation. So I noticed when I was driving in that a lot of these northern white cedars here that line the road towards the lake had been broken off by winds. I think that's some of them right there. But some of that wood might have gone into being split up and used as firewood. And so you put that wood into a wood stove, and then you transform that chemical bond energy into heat energy. So we can transform energy from one state to another. But the real critical thing about the second law is that whenever we do a transformation within the system where that occurs, there's always some energy lost in that process. No energy transformation seems to be able to be 100% efficient. And that means for systems that take in energy and utilize energy, they have to keep taking it in. They have to replenish it because they're bleeding it off and it has to be replenished. So what that means is that open systems, like our bodies that take in energy, we can be in one of three energetic states. Any system that is taking in more energy than it's bleeding off from its energy transformation is said to be a neg or anti-entropic system, and that's a system that grows. So, all these trees around us right now, they're in that phase. They're actually taking in more energy from the sun and converting it in photosynthesis than they're bleeding off in their metabolic transformations, and as a result, these trees grow bigger each year. A second state happens when a system reaches maturity, and then the amount of energy coming in is equal to the amount of energy being dissipated, and these are said to be dynamic equilibrium systems. So all of us have sort of reached that state in our lives. We each take in about 2,000 food calories of energy and release about 2,000 calories of heat energy a day, and as a result, growth stops. And then the third state is a state where a system takes in less energy than it's bleeding off from its transformations. And this is said to be an entropic state. And it's often said that as systems lose energy, that entropy is a process that moves from a state of order to disorder. And I personally don't like those terms because they're very subjective. Those are sort of human things that we label on things. So I think a more objective way of measuring entropy is systems move from complexity toward simplicity, or from concentration of energy in materials toward diffusion of energy in materials. And I think that's a better way to look at this process of entropy. So imagine we get a heavy windstorm, and we see one of these trees come down. It uproots out of the yard, and then it dies. That is an entropic system now. It can't take in energy, and as decomposers start to move in that tree and start to extract the energy from it, that complex structure of the tree starts to be slowly simplified and broken down. Its vascular tissues get broken down. Its complex molecules like cellulose and lignin get broken down to simple molecules like carbon dioxide and water that then just diffuse out into the air. And after a number of decades, that tree will be completely gone. All of its complexity broken down to very simple molecules that diffuse into the air or into the ground, and all of its energy dissipated as well. Now, the reason I want to mention this is that life has been on this planet for, it's believed, 3.8 billion years. That's a long time. And it's hard to grasp numbers like that, so I often will use an analogy. I'll say, think of a sheet of paper, the thickness of it representing a century. The question would be, how tall a stack of paper would we need to represent 3.8 billion years? Each sheet equaling 1 century. And in fact, we'd need a sheet that's a stack that's going to be over 3 miles in height. That is a long, long time. And during that time, life on this planet has not only sustained itself, it's thrived. And we're going to get into why it does that. But for the first, 3.5 billion years, the biosphere on this planet was an anti-entropic system. It was taking in more energy from solar gain than it was bleeding off its heat to outer space. And as a result, it built up all this biomass that we have on the planet, like coal beds, oil reserves. It built up an oxygen atmosphere at 21%. And then around 300 million years ago, it became a dynamic equilibrium system. We know this because studies suggest the oxygen levels in the atmosphere have been very steady, right around 21%. But in the last century or so, because of the actions of one organism, that's us, and all of our energy transformations, the biosphere is now an entropic system. And it's getting more and more entropic each year because our collective use of energy just keeps going up and up and up. And so we are actually releasing way more heat into outer space than is being replaced by solar capture and photosynthesis. And as a result, the biosphere is becoming simplified. So every single sort of environmental problem we could think about, it's a problem of entropy. Think about, soil erosion due to industrial scale agriculture. You're taking very complex systems in soil, and they're being simplified, and you're taking concentrated stores of nutrients that are diffusing out. If those nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus get into a lake, like Lake Champlain, they can cause algal blooms, which further simplify the system as a lot of organisms start dying off because there's not enough oxygen out there. Removal of primary tropical rainforest in the Amazon to make way for soybean plantations for biofuels is an entropic process. We're taking these very, very complex ecosystems and replacing them with monocultures. The over-harvesting of the ocean's fisheries, an entropic process. We're taking, again, very complex ocean ecosystems and simplify them. And even the burning of fossil fuels is entropy. We're taking concentrated stores of carbon and diffusing it out into the atmosphere. So at its core, if we're ever going to get a handle on this, we're going to have to figure out how to be much more frugal in our use of energy. And that's why I say that thinking about sustainable outcomes and stuff is all about right relationship. Studies have shown that as we have developed more and more and more energy efficient technologies, our per capita consumption of energy doesn't go down, it continuously goes up. Technologies are a very important tool we can use, but they are not going to solve things by themselves. We have to develop right relationship to ourselves, to our communities, to Mother Earth, in ways that fosters relationships that are really healing and beneficial and not destructive. And then, if we can have those sorts of values and relationships, then we can actually start decreasing our energy consumption. So, is this sort of making sense? Is this any questions on that?
Whole year of my class.
What's that?
It's just like a whole year of high school science. Just
Oh,
in
good.
one
We've
little
distilled it down into
blurb.
10 minutes.
I actually just had you come in and teach my whole class, and then maybe that's what you do.
I just wanted to add, you were talking about energy conservation, and there's a lot of movement around carbon sequestration in the world as well, and I think that often we don't talk about that as part of the shift away from entropy in the broader system. I'd like to remember that too.
Yeah, and well, that is, I mean, again, we can do that, again, if we are going to start really looking carefully at how we extract things and use things. You know, our forests around here can store a lot of carbon, and we can still extract usable forest products, but we have to do it in a way that's maybe a bit more conservative than we tend to think about. A lot of people say, oh, well, if you clear cut a forest, you can take all that stored energy in that wood and then store it away and sequester it in building materials and stuff. I think what people don't realize is after about 80 years, half of the carbon in the forest is below the ground. And as a forest ages, more and more is below the ground than above ground. So if you clear cut a forest, you're going to store some of that carbon away, but if, let's say, that forest is 100 years old, you'll actually bleed off way more carbon than you're storing away. And that takes another century to bring that back in. So it means, yeah, we have to think about how we deal with these things in a different way. All right, so that said, that's sort of like the underlying, I think, foundational piece of where we're going is not the right path. And I should mention also that complex systems are nested within each other. So like our cells are nested in organs, our organs are nested in our bodies now are nested in this circle. And so if any one system, like a socioeconomic system, which is nested within the biosphere, if any one system grows at rates that they are degrading that larger system, creating the entropy in the larger system, you're going to get feedback loops. You're going to get self-regulating feedback loops that are going to kick in, and it's going to cause that smaller system to change. It's not a question of if it will change, it will change. And my guess is that if we don't really figure out how to change our behaviors, well, they'll be changed for us, and probably in this century, because that feedback is going to start doing that. So that's sort of the foundation of why we're on the wrong path. I mean, one of the reasons, but that's, certainly something we have to address.
Could you describe feedback loops?
Yeah.
I come from not a natural resource.
Okay. So there's two basic types of feedback loops. They're often called positive and negative, but those are probably not great terms because they give the idea that one's good and one's bad. Both are very appropriate and important in different phases. So negative feedback loops are so named because every time you go around the loop, the elements in the loop reverse what they're doing the time before. So everything switches. And it's sort of like, it's also been called like steersman feedback. It's like if you're in a sailboat and you have your tiller and you want to go that way, and so you get a little off course, you pull it this way, but maybe overcompensate and you have to push it back that way. Each time you move the tiller, you're negating what you did the time before, and that's why it became called negative feedback. A better name for it is self-regulating feedback. And this is really appropriate in mature systems like our bodies. A lot of the feedback that's happening in us right now is this self-regulating feedback, which keeps body temperature right at 98.6, blood sugar levels very carefully controlled, CO2 levels, blood pH, all those things created in a nice stable way. The other type of feedback, called positive feedback, as you go around the loop, every element just keeps reinforcing what it did the time before. Just gets more and more and more reinforced. So a better term for maybe positive feedback is self-reinforcing feedback. And that's really important in anti-entropic systems that are developing, because you can get these changes where the system flips to a higher level of complexity. So they're very appropriate there. So, for example, we all started off life as a single microscopic cell, and as our zygote was developing, it got to be this what's called blastopore, this hollow ball of hundreds of cells, and then it underwent, because of positive feedback, what's called gastrulation, where the whole ball turned in on itself, and all of a sudden, right away, instead of just having one cell type, we now started getting different cell types: endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm. We had another bifurcation event due to positive feedback where we developed a notochord, and then another one with limb buds. So these self-reinforcing or positive feedback loops are really critical in taking systems as they're developing and bringing up to higher and higher levels of complexity. But in a mature system, a self-reinforcing feedback loop can be pretty nasty. It can upset that system. So they're both appropriate in different settings. So does that help?
Is it the way in which systems utilize energy and behave? Like, I'm trying to understand much even broader, not only the type of feedback loop, but in what you're describing.
Yeah, energy is always going to be flowing through these loops.
Okay, so it's not an energetic behavior.
It's
more bio-behavior?
what's that?
A bio-behavior?
It's not just bio, because this happens in all sorts of systems. So, we could look like at, let me just map out a positive feedback loop right now. Because we're, let's say, putting CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere that sort of are heat trappers, our climate's warming. And this is more pronounced as you move towards the poles. So you go up to like Alaska, boy, it is warming up there really fast. So as it's warming, that causes the sea ice up in the Arctic Ocean to diminish, which means now that a lot of the light that used to hit that ice and reflect back out into space is being absorbed in the water. So that's heating up the water more, which is heating up the atmosphere more. And so you're getting this feedback loop, in this case a self-reinforcing one, where every time you go around the loop, it's getting hotter, and it's getting hotter, and it's getting hotter.
Vicious cycles.
Yeah, and what happens is eventually these self-reinforcing feedback loops come to a point, it's called a bifurcation event, where the system flips in a whole new mode of behavior. So that bifurcation would have been that blastopore infolding, or the development of the notochord, or the development of limb buds. It just flipped, and boom, all of a sudden those things are there. Question?
Good eye. Lots. Are we going to talk more about that moment at some point?
The bifurcation moment?
Yeah.
We could certainly talk more about that moment. I mean, do you have any particular question about it, or?
I'm just really curious about it. I feel like I don't fully understand it, but I feel really intrigued by it. And so just in the I don't even know what my question is. I just know that I'm curious about what that actually looks like.
Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
an example or a different context.
Sure. So the fall of the Berlin Wall would have been a bifurcation point. So within a system, you can have this feedback. Let's say if it's self-reinforcing feedback, it's building up, it's building up. That can be happening at a gradual pace, but eventually it builds up to the point it's like the straw that breaks the camel's back. The system just can't keep going that way anymore, and it flips. So, social change movements often do this. They get going, and they start building up feedback. So, women's suffrage, started in the middle 1800s. It took 70-some years, but it caught traction and started getting more and more self-reinforcement. And then we all of a sudden get to the point where the whole political system shifts and women get the right to vote. So those would be examples of bifurcation events.
Can I ask another
What's that?
I have one more question,
Yeah.
which is, so if a positive feedback loop is going, I'm thinking there's one that's like the self-regulation, and then you name the one that's reinforcing. So when the positive feedback loop or the self-reinforcing one is going down a particular track, then if there's a shift in the course of that, that's not necessarily a bifurcation, or is like the movement that goes towards that potential bifurcation moment, is that another self-reinforcing feedback loop, but that has a different like direction of movement?
Well, what it means is, let's say I think the idea of going down a path and just turning, that would be the bifurcation. In other words, you've moved off of the route you were on, you've switched. So bifurcations happen quickly, and they just change sort of the behavior of the system, and the system may at that point fall under self-regulating feedback, or it may go through another self-reinforcing feedback loop. The way we did developmentally, we went through a whole number of them to get to the level of complexity our bodies are today. So I think it depends on the system and the dynamics in the system.
And like what's around it too, right? So
Oh yeah.
It
It's-
depends on outside systems too.
Absolutely. So a lot of these things can happen within the system, but outside factors can also affect them because these systems are all intermeshed and influencing each other all the time. All right, so let's move on, because I want to talk about the principle of self-organization and coevolution to develop this model of how we can really start thinking about creating human systems that really do function well and do it in a way that doesn't cause harm to other systems. So Matt mentioned that, this idea of complex systems, this is really new in Western science. Basically, I guess it's maybe not new to Western science, but it's new to Western science over the last 4 centuries. Because for about the last 4 centuries, Western science has been enmeshed in a linear reduction paradigm. If you want to learn about the world around you, you take it apart, and then you figure out how the parts interrelate. That's the linearity, because our view was, these parts always work in a lockstep way, and then you understand the system. And probably the person that was most important in developing this worldview was René Descartes in the 1600s. And he was someone who was enamored by machines of his age, wind-up clocks, windmills, water mills, fountains. He saw these things having parts that moved without us having to do anything about them. And he said, animals and other organisms are no different. We're just all really machines. And so even with human, if we can know all the parts and we know how they interact, we will know the system. So to Descartes, the sum of the parts equaled the whole. And then at the end of the 19th century, as we started moving into the 20th century, a lot of people doing research in various disciplines, like anthropology, sociology, psychology, cybernetics, biology, ecology, all started saying, this linear reductionistic view is not really helping us understand the things we're looking at. And so right after World War II, there was a series of conferences convened in New York City that brought people together from all these different disciplines. And the whole idea was for just to get down and talk to each other about what they were seeing in the systems they were studying. And they began to realize they were all seeing the exact same patterns and processes. Didn't matter if it was a human system or an ecosystem or a biological system or a climatological system, they're seeing the same stuff. They're seeing these feedback loops. They were seeing bifurcation events. They were seeing emergent properties, things that you could never define by just looking at the parts and how they may be interrelated. And so that started to give rise to this new paradigm in science of complex systems. But as we'll see, the Western scientists were probably the last people that understood this. This is not rocket science, this stuff. It's very intuitive, and so I'll show you in a bit how Western scientists were way behind in this process. And too bad, too, because pretty much everything we deal with is a complex system. And if we really want to figure out how to work with these systems correctly, we have to do it in a whole different way than we're trained to do. Because we're trained in Western society to see the world as piecemeal. If there's a problem, you figure out what the little fix is. That doesn't work in a complex system. In a complex system, you really need to understand the large-scale patterns and processes if you're going to start to wade into it. Now, so as we get into like the 1970s, we start getting this body of theory around complex systems, and one of the principles that's developed at that time is the principle of self-organization. And self-organization relates to a system that's in that anti-entropic phase that's growing. But self-organizing systems don't just get bigger, they get more complex. And the complexities derive from the parts within the system, whether they're cells in a body like our bodies, or species in an ecosystem, or any players in a human system. That complexity is derived from the parts becoming more specialized through time and tightly integrated with each other in such a way that each part or entity doing what it needs to do to sustain itself creates conditions that sustain the whole. And as a result, these self-organizing systems through time grow increasingly energy efficient, stable, and resilient. So I'll go through that one more time. Yeah.
Three more.
Yeah. By the time we're done this morning, you'll have it down. So self-organizing systems not only grow, but they increase in complexity. The complexity derived from the parts becoming ever more specialized and tightly integrated together, such that each part doing what it needs to do to sustain itself creates conditions that sustain the whole. And as a result, these self-organizing systems grow increasingly energy efficient, resilient, and stable. So I mentioned our bodies are a great example of this. I already said we all started life as a single microscopic cell, and now our bodies hold about 40 trillion cells. But luckily for us, we didn't just grow. That one cell just didn't multiply to 40 trillion. We self-organized. And so that one cell differentiated into eventually 254 major cell types, skin cells, muscle cells, bone cells, nerve cells. And the specialization in the cells goes even further. Some neurons only communicate with a muscle cell. Other neurons only communicate with a sensory cell. Other neurons link motor neurons to sensory neurons. Our cells are really specialized, but luckily for us, they're tightly integrated together, such that each cell needing to do what it has to do creates conditions that sustain the whole. And as a result, our bodies are very stable. You go into our core internal bodily environment, temperature right at 98.6, blood pH right at 6.8, blood sugar levels carefully controlled, everything very stable, and we're resilient. We get sick or we get wounded, we heal. And that's because we are highly self-organized. So is this sort of making sense? All right, so what I'd like to do is shift to look at how this process of self-organization works in ecosystems through evolutionary time, through the process of coevolution. Now, in the natural world out here, the bottom line currency is energy. And it's finite. There's only so much energy out here, and that's particularly true if you're, let's say, an organism in the wintertime around here. The energy is really dwindled, and if you're, let's say, you're a coyote or you're a fox, you're going to have to be really very aware of your energy expenditures, because there's not much out there, and you can't be willy-nilly just running around and using up energy. You're not going to make it. So energy is finite, and what that means is that nature is always sort of urging its organisms to develop adaptations or strategies to make them more energy efficient. Because if an organism does develop ways to be more energy efficient, it means it can support a larger population on the same fixed amount of energy. And nature is always sort of urging out organisms that are energy wasteful. So this is sort of the driver of coevolution, energy efficiency, trying to get organisms through time to be more and more energy efficient. And this is what's going to drive self-organization in ecosystems. Now, for a number of decades, ecologists have been saying, you know, we shouldn't be moving organisms from one part of the world to another, because when we do that, we create these young ecological interactions that are usually very energy inefficient and usually harmful to one or more parties. So a good example of this was the accidental introduction of the chestnut blight fungus into North America. It came in on oriental chestnuts planted at the Bronx Zoo and Botanic Garden back in 1904. And don't, if you're ever down there, make the mistake that I did about mentioning that. That did not go over well. They're still really sensitive about that. It's not like something they really wear as a feather in their cap. I mean, but the thing is that fungus in those old world chestnuts had co-evolved for so long with such a mild form of parasitism, they didn't even see lesions on this tree. They didn't even know the fungus was there. So it wasn't their fault. They didn't even know. At the time of that introduction, the American chestnut was probably the most common forest tree east of the Mississippi River. In the heart of its range, places like Tennessee and Kentucky, 1 out of every 2 trees was an American chestnut. And we have pre-blight photographs of these trees, which were immense for an eastern tree. They could grow up to 13 feet in diameter, almost as large as this circle we've made right here. If you can imagine a broad-leaved eastern tree of that size. They produced the most edible nut of any tree in North America. They were truly the signature tree of the temperate deciduous forest. It only took about 30 years for that fungus to escape and almost completely eradicate that species. It was probably the single biggest impact to the temperate deciduous forest ecosystem that happened in probably millions of years. It was really, really big in a not very positive way. So that's an example of how species can be harmed. Now, I'd like you to contemplate the fungus. If you're a host-specific parasite, the worst thing you could do would be to eradicate your host species. Because if you do that, you've just done in your whole population. And if you think about it, that was a really energy inefficient thing for that fungus to do. It would have been so much better served if it didn't kill off its host tree. It would have lived longer, it would have reproduced more, there'd be more of a resource for its offspring. The fungus did just about the worst possible thing it could do. But if 2 species make it through that initial contact without extinguishing each other, natural selection kicks into gear, driven by energy efficiency, and starts urging those species to adjust their ecologies to be more energy efficient, and this usually results in their relationships growing to be more beneficial through time. So this can go right from an outright predation, like that fungus was doing to the chestnut, killing it, and these relationships can co-evolve right up to mutualisms, where both species benefit by interacting and have to interact to survive. So the best example I know of about a mutualism that probably started off as a predation, way long ago, involves the bull's horn acacia tree. This is a tree that occurs down in Central America, and its resident Azteca acacia ant. Now, these 2 species have co-evolved for a long time and have a very tight mutualism. And in their time together, the bull's horn acacia tree has developed 3 morphological features to service its ants. The first is the thorns that used to ward off the mouths of herbivorous animals have grown really big, and they're pliable. They no longer protect the tree anymore, but the ants drill into them, they hollow them out, and that's where they raise their young. So now they have housing on the tree. Secondly, every leaf stem has what's called a nectary, or open sap well, where the sap comes right up to the surface. The ants go there to drink. That's where they get their water and their energy resource. And then around the margins of all the leaflets are these little globules called Belchian bodies that are loaded with nutrients. The ants harvest them and eat them for their nutrition without impacting the leaves at all, and then the Belgian bodies grow right back. The ants have become so specialized that they can only survive on acacia sap and Belgian bodies. If they are removed, you can offer them all sorts of stuff, honey, whatever, they won't eat it because they only eat these two things. They're super, super specialized. But in return, they give their host tree the most advanced plant defense system in the world. They have a very venomous sting that wards off all herbivores. These trees never get touched by anything. Not only that, if vines try to crawl up the acacia, the ants will go down, they will chop through those vines and kill them. If a surrounding tree tries to encroach in the acacia space, the ants will go over that tree and defoliate it. So if you remove the acacia ants from their tree, within about a month's time it'll be dead because it has no other defense system. It relies solely on its ants. And based on the mandibular structure of these ants, we have pretty good evidence they're derived from leafcutter ants. So way back when the ancestral acacia and the ancestral leafcutter ant first came into contact in a young ecological interaction, it might not have been a very pretty sight. Maybe trees are being stripped of leaves and killed. That was energy inefficient, and somehow nature kicked in and urged these species to adjust their ecologies, and it co-evolved right up to this mutualism where they both benefit and have to interact to survive. And we don't know the route that co-evolved relationship took. It could have gone many, many different routes, but that's where it ended up. And mutualisms are very common in the natural world. They're quite common. And yet I remember when I was first getting into ecology back as an undergraduate in the late 1960s, the only interactions we heard about in nature were competition, predation, and parasitism. Never heard a word about mutualism. Just didn't come up. And what's really interesting, Charles Darwin was writing about this stuff, and it wasn't even noticed by the scientific community for 110 years. Because when his Origin of Species came out, the social Darwinists pounced on it right away and framed this notion of survival of the fittest as being the most aggressive, the most competitive, because that maintained the world order. It created power and kept the underclass completely disempowered. And that framing was so effective that the scientific community bought it. And they saw the fittest as being the fiercest, the most aggressive, the most competitive. And Darwin didn't see it that way. It's interesting, after his second book, Descent of Man, came out, he started getting into these really sort of what looked like arcane studies, looking at barnacles and earthworms and orchid pollination. And his friends kept saying, "What are you doing? You did such amazing work. What are you doing?" Well, what he was doing is cataloging all these mutualisms. He was starting to see the world as filled with them, and his view of the fittest was the most flexible, that could function to its greatest degree in its ecosystem. And it took 110 years before the scientific community caught up to what he was doing because of paradigmatic framing that completely altered what he was writing about. So mutualism's very, very common out there. It only makes sense. If you can help your partner, you're helping yourself. You know, if you help your bull's horn acacia survive, it lives longer, you live longer, you reproduce more. It only makes sense. This whole notion that somehow we can create systems where competition is going to make us thrive is really pretty crazy. I mean, you wouldn't set up a family like that. Say all the kids come to the table, all right, just compete for your food tonight. Well, just let that happen. No, it's not going to happen. You find out mutually beneficial ways of interacting. So people all right with that so far? All right, so another type of interaction that happens in the natural world is interspecific competition. Energy is finite, resources are finite, so there's always going to be competition happening. But the difference is, in the natural world, instead of embracing it, species move away from it. Competition is actually a way to innovate and become specialized to avoid it. Because when organisms compete, they're using up energy. If they can figure out how to specialize, they can coexist, they can actually get an energy boost. So natural selection is going to urge them to specialize and move away from their competitive struggles. And this happens through a process called niche separation. So a niche is sort of the total ecological role of an organism. We could never pin down the niche of any organism because it's so expansive. It involves all their adaptations, all their behaviors, all their interactions. It's really, really a complex thing. So ecologists start breaking it down and say, well, let's just look at the foraging niche. How does this bird go about foraging for food? That we can maybe get a handle on. So again, if there's energy losses through competition, natural selection is going to push for energy efficiency, causing species to specialize through time and move away from that competition through this process of niche separation. There's basically three ways this happens. One's called temporal separation, where species are active at different times of the day or night, or active at different times of the season. So we get owls that are active at night when they're looking for prey, and hawks that are active in the day. And in this way, they do not directly compete because they've specialized as to when they're going to be active. And this doesn't just happen in animals, this also happens in plants. If you were going to be around here, let's say in mid-April, and you wanted to venture into some of our calcium-enriched forests here in Vermont, these are forests that have canopies of sugar maple and white ash and bitternut hickory. You go in those forests in mid-April, long before the canopy leaves have broken bud, the understories will be bright emerald green. The ground is carpeted in the leaves of wild leeks and Dutchman's breeches and squirrel corn and trout lilies and spring beauties. And all five of those understory plants are said to be vernal ephemerals. Vernal for spring, and ephemeral because they do all their photosynthesis from early April into early May. And then when the canopy leaves come on, they die back down below below ground level, and a whole new cohort of plants comes up, like the blue cohosh and the maidenhair fern and things like that. And in this way, these two groups of plants coexist without competing for light at all. And it makes our calcium-enriched woodlands have the most species-rich herbaceous understories of any of our forests around here because of this temporal separation. Another way species can separate their niches is through what's called microhabitat separation. So we could look at white-breasted nuthatches, black-capped chickadees in terms of this. These are two native birds that both forage on insects in the same ecosystems. They can even be foraging at the same tree at the same time and not compete because the chickadees are specializing to glean insects from branches and the nuthatches to glean them from the trunks of trees. And in this way, they can coexist without any energy losses from competition. And a third way to do it is seen in Darwin's finches down the Galapagos through what's called resource partitioning. You can get these flocks of different species of finch, where the large-beaked finch just eat the large seeds, the small-beaked finch just eat the small seeds, and again, can be feeding right next to each other without competing. But you'll notice in all these instances, these species have become more specialized. So here again, that process, that specialization of the parts and the relationality that develops between them is really, really critical. So the last example I'm going to give before shifting this and starting to think about human systems is pollination. Let's say there was most of the mowings up here on Shelburne Farms are hay fields, so they don't have a lot of wildflowers, but there's some areas in Vermont where you can find open meadows that are loaded with different species of wildflowers. And if you were going to catalog how many insect pollinators you could identify from, let's say, May all the way through October, in one of those wildflower meadows, you'd probably be able to find over 1,000 different pollinating insect species. All these different species of bees and bumblebees and wasps and hornets and flies and beetles and ants and moths and butterflies. All of them pollinating at different times of day or night, different times of the season in different ways, can support all these different myriad of pollinators. And this is a big part of why ecosystems are so stable and resilient. In any critical role, whether it's pollination, whether it's decomposition, whether it's photosynthesis, we don't just have a handful of species doing these things, we have hundreds to thousands of them doing it. And that means if we lose any one species, the system's probably going to be okay, but there's so many more still doing that same critical role. So the way this works, yeah, question? Okay. So, sort of in a nutshell, the way this process of self-organization works in ecosystems via coevolution through evolutionary time is energy efficiency is driving species to co-evolve. As they co-evolve, they become more specialized. As they become more specialized, their niches or their ecological roles shrink and get smaller. As niches shrink, it means through time, ecosystems can support more and more and more species, building up their biotic diversity. And that gives rise to more and more repetition of function in these critical functional roles. We have more and more and more species doing that same critical role, which gives rise to the resiliency and the stability. Is that making sense to people?
Say that whole thing.
Yeah.
Should we draw that out?
We could draw that out.
That'd be a good
Sure.
visual.
All right. So let's draw that out.
Thank you.
While you draw that out, I have a question
Yeah.
about
Feeding.
so these three ways that you described: temporal, cycle, habitat, separation,
And
pollination.
resource partitioning.
These are all resource.
These are all what?
These are number 2 is resource.
Yeah, number 3 was resource partitioning. These are just different ways that species specialize to separate their niches so they don't compete, and then save the energy in that process.
I am having a little bit of a question about it seems like a discrepancy between partitioning or niche development and redundancy, because, you know, as the species merge and evolve into more and more specialized functions, there's a creation of an ability to have lots and lots of different species. But then we're saying, like, they're filling the same function, like pollination.
Yes,
Would
so-
that be counter? Like, if they're all separated in different niches, are they not filling the same function?
They're doing it in slightly different ways. That's why they can coexist, because they're all specialized in slightly different ways, but they're still doing the same function. They're still doing the pollination. They're still doing the decomposition.
Broadly, pollination can still happen, but in the event of sort of impact on the species, like with the acacia tree we're talking about, that particular species might disappear.
Exactly. But then you have so many more
Other
still
ones.
doing that same important role that the system's fine.
Yeah.
So, in a way, self-organization is always causing systems to decentralize critical functional roles, to get more and more players doing that, to build up that stability and resiliency. Whenever we move towards concentration of critical functional roles, we're moving away from resiliency and stability. And we'll look at that with some human systems, right? So it's really decentralizing these things so we have more and more players doing it. And then if you do lose one, the system's still fine.
Right.
All right.
Yes. You're gonna draw that.
All right, I'll try to draw it. So I'm just going to draw it, I guess, and then we'll try to take a look at it. But, or maybe I'll just do it down on the ground here so people see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to start with energy efficiency. I'm just calling that EE. That is going to drive